Hello and welcome to the Anyone Can Play Guitar podcast,
which gives you, the listener, a series of hints and pointers on your journey as a musical artist.
providing you with interviews from those in the music industry, along with our own experiences.
Ben and James shine some light on the many pitfalls and opportunities that being a musician has to offer.
Last week, Ben hit new levels of excitement as he spoke to Roddy Wundle of Idlewild about support slots, middlemen, and having a creative space. This week, we have the first of what is a really brilliant delve into music fandom with Mark Duffett of Chester University, where we discuss tradition, consistent image, being memorable, playing your audience as an instrument, and using your music.
Welcome to episode 7 with me, Ben, and him,
James.
So I don't want to sound like Beyonce at the start of all these podcasts, but I do have I do have a question. Why have you written down REM Ebo the Letter on your notes for this particular podcast?
I'll tell you for why, Ben. I was listening to that very song by chance. Not so much by chance, I was deliberately listening to music,
Good.
But it just happened to come on shuffle.
Yes.
And one of the lines in that song is, "This fame thing, I don't get it," which sort of ties in very neatly to...
That's a nice segue
I thought so.
to today's episode, because I was thinking about that and I thought, this episode is really about the boss, and I thought, it's not really about Bruce Springsteen at all, but if it was, that would be brilliant. But it's about fans, and they are the boss, or the bosses, in my opinion.
Well, one way of looking at it, I guess.
It's definitely a way of looking at it, because without fans, you haven't got much, really, have you?
Well, you know, you're just making music.
Yeah.
Which might be all
yeah,
that you want, but for a lot of people, they'll want...
to continue it, have a living, and fans are really important to that. And I think this episode is really good for like highlighting some of the key bits about fandom and how to keep fans, how to get fans, how to engage with fans. And you found Mark, didn't you? Who we're going to speak to today, Mark Duffett.
I did, yes. Again, having studied a bit on fandom.
A bit. Your dissertation at university was about fandom.
That's true, and it wasn't specifically on music fans, but all the same, it just sparked a thought of, I bet there's some academic angle to this, that a lot of people will have looked into music fandom in a lot more detail than I or most people who are in bands, and so found Mark, and he was extremely up for talking about all things fandom. He's
extremely knowledgeable.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, when we get into it, he comes with some pretty good credentials.
Yeah.
And among various other people, and among various other things in his career, studied Elvis a hell of a lot, who wasn't too bad at getting fans.
He was
keeping
pretty
fans, retaining
popular,
fans,
wasn't he?
Yeah.
Constantly gets new fans as well.
Indeed, yeah.
Which is remarkable. And this is another double header.
Mark was extremely generous with his time, and there was just so much to talk about. So,
if honest, I could have done about 3 or 4.
Well, possibly.
Yeah.
So Mark came up with 10 topics to talk through in relation to fandom, and they're all some reasonably obvious in the sense of the things that they are, but when you get into it, it's quite interesting to talk through the various different bits.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those episodes...
Others less obvious as well.
Yeah, well, definitely, yeah. It's one of those episodes where, when you get into it, like, it is really, really interesting. Just from, like, even if you're not in a band, thinking about your fans, just, like, how the culture of fandom works and how it kind of goes in circles and comes back, and then some cultures are born out of other cultures just by repeating it and stuff like that.
Yeah, there's generational elements, there's various sort of social groups and how people might target different subcultures and all the rest of it. There's all sorts of stuff to it. And as you've said, every musician, if they want to get a level of success, however you're measuring success, you're going to need fans, people who want to listen to your music.
Enjoy your art.
Yeah.
So I think without any further ado, let's listen to what...
Part one
of our conversation with Mark Duffett about fans.
So Mark, welcome to the podcast. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, pleasure. So for our audience, just like to give a little bit of background on yourself, and what you've done in terms of sort of research on fans and sort of your career to date?
Yeah, I started looking at fans about 20 years ago. I did a PhD on the relationship between Elvis and his fans at the University of Wales, and completed that in 1999. And then all the time since then, I've been working at the University of Chester. So I've been working at one place all the time, and through that process, I've done quite a lot of articles and things, book chapters, a couple of edited books on fandom, and a book called Understanding Fandom from 2013 that was quite popular amongst students. And in recent years, my career's got to the level where I've been invited over to, Moscow last year, and some interesting things are going on. I've been quoted in New York Times and Rolling Stone recently.
Wow.
So, yeah, that's where I'm at now after all of that process.
Oh, excellent. And you've sent us through, prior to this, a list of sort of 10 sort of what I think are going to be some really interesting topics to talk around fandom. So I think let's just dive straight into it. So the first one on the list was, and this is things for sort of artists to be thinking about. We've got drawn tradition without being traditional. So what do you mean by that?
I suppose I started thinking recently about how music progresses in traditions, and I think what a lot of musicians do, or the ones that seem to become successful and famous, what some of them do is they kind of go through this process of almost like, it feels like turning the wheel but discarding the wheel. In other words, they draw from the past, they match it to the needs of the present, and when they do that, it looks like what they produced is something new. So I mean, no, let's think of some examples. Well, obviously, Elvis, I study Elvis a lot, and he draws on kind of old country and blues, kind of reworks them, creates rock and roll and rockabilly, and that seems to be an exciting new thing. But you can see it all over the place. I mean, another one I was just thinking of was Kraftwerk, when they did Autobahn back in 1975, reworking the Beach Boys,
Right.
or the punks reworking rock and roll in the 1970s. There's a sort of, or Oasis, like reworking the Beatles, right? There's a sort of, they're drawing on the past, but they're not necessarily drawing on the recent past. What's interesting is there's often a bit of a gap, and through that process of kind of updating something from maybe 10, 20 years ago, doing it in a different way, they seem to create something a bit more exciting. So that was really what I meant.
How much of that do you think is sort of a generational change needed? So, you're saying there's generally a gap between an artist sort of, picking something from so far back in the past. Do you think there's necessarily a gap needed in a sort of, I don't know, like a fan's life, where it's a new audience that comes around that they can pitch the previous two who haven't necessarily experienced it before? How relevant do you think that might?
I think that's certainly part of it, that when a new generation comes around, they want something of their own, and because there's nothing new under the sun, what people do is sort of rebel against the most recent thing. But I think that process has become a bit blurred, perhaps in the internet era, but certainly before that, you could see it quite clearly in the sort of 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s kind of era. But yeah, it definitely is partly a generational thing, and I guess the relationship with fans there is that, when a new generation comes along, they want something different. But to my mind, the interesting thing is that the different thing often is something that's actually been done before, but they're not necessarily doing it the same. That's the interesting thing. They're not necessarily just repeating it. They're sort of picking a perverse potential in it, a kind of like they're taking a skewed angle on it. And I guess the people who lived through it at the time and the more recent people, there almost needs to be a little bit of forgetting, right? That this is the way you do it. And so people have to come along and do it in a slightly different way that kind of don't know the protocol or decide to ignore it.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I guess equally, if you were trying to sort of rebadge something and do it your own way, but the thing you were rebadging is just from about 5 years ago, the same people have lived through it.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and it's like out of fashion by that point, isn't it? So it doesn't seem to be a very cool thing to do. Yeah.
No, definitely. So I think that's an interesting starter. So the next one that you had on the list was having a consistent image.
Yeah. The reason I had this one on is one of my colleagues, Mike Jones, used to be a songwriter for the group Guadalcanal Diary, who were an 80s pop group. And the record companies could never quite figure out how to deal with them because they made this sort of kind of Latin-y kind of pop. I think it was described as jangle pop somewhere. But the songwriter was a Welsh Marxist writing for them. The group sort of looked really cool and made this sort of Latin-y sort of faux exotic music. And it was like the image, the music and the story didn't quite fit together. And I think when a band starts off, they're particularly in this age of social media, right? You know, they're seen sort of all of a sudden that people are taking pictures of them, people are listening to them, they're doing maybe like interviews if they're getting to that level, and there needs to be a certain consistency. What do you think of that? Do you think that's true?
So that's interesting. So in terms of consistency of, you know, whether the content of the lyrics and the clothes and the style as opposed to consistency over time.
Yeah.
If that makes sense, you know, so an artist or a band might change their image, like a Madonna, for example. Will constantly change image, but within that image, she's probably consistent at the time, I guess.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I was kind of just meaning it more like in relation to these three different aspects, like image, music, and story. Hopefully that, you know, they should all be interesting as well. But I think there is a danger that if what you look like and what you sound like and what you say about yourself doesn't quite fit together, it doesn't quite gel, then I think people have a harder time understanding it.
I think. I think that's really valid. I think one of the things that in a previous episode when we were talking to Mark Radcliffe, he was sort of going down the point of, before, you know, the internet, a lot of people had built up an anticipation about what a band's going to be like. You'd often read a lot about them and know quite a lot about an artist before you ever got the opportunity to listen to them or potentially see them live. And again,
build your own story a little bit.
And if the end product, or if you'd then visually seen them and it didn't match to what your anticipation had sort of grown to be expecting, I think then that would potentially lead to a bit of disappointment. And I think there is something in that, because even today when everything's sort of instant, I think there is, you know, if you've just listened to something over the internet and then you finally, you know, see the video or you see the band live or whatever it might be, and it doesn't tally with, you know, if it's something completely different in terms of that image, I could see that potentially putting some...
I'm trying to think of examples where that's happened to me as well, because I listened to a podcast recently which had the band Spoon in it, American band.
Okay.
And the songs and how they spoke when I saw them were completely different things. I wasn't disappointed. It was quite nice actually, because I set this own story in my head about what I expected the band to look like and the kind of image they had, and they weren't like that. And it was quite a nice surprise, really, because I shouldn't have done it really, but you kind of help yourself.
Okay.
And I think the consistency is quite good, because I think a good band who do this at the minute, Coldplay, every album has a different, I wouldn't say a message, but has a different theme to it. So at the latest album is very colourful. And through all their videos are already colourful. Staging of the shows are very colourful. Chris Martin's always wearing these pink blue t-shirts, but the music also sounds, in my opinion, a little bit poppier than compared to something like Rush of Blood to the Head, which is when he was wearing these long sleeve t-shirts in the free trade images and stuff like that. That's quite a deep record. Definitely in comparison to this. I mean, this one's got Beyonce on. But it's nothing against it. It's just, I think that constant image, when they're releasing a product, does fit. And I bet that's quite hard to do, actually.
Well, I guess one of the things we're talking about there in a way is branding, isn't it? You know,
Yeah.
that would be the other name for it. But certainly, what you were talking about with Mark Radcliffe is almost like being hyped in some way and delivering on the hype, which can be a fantasy delivery, right? As long as the expectation is in some way matched. And the other thing was that I was thinking of was when you were talking about that was in the 19th century. You know, there were no records in the early part of the 19th century, mid part of the 19th century. Yet people still went to see music and talked about it. So at that time, you know, all you had was a sort of a written or a spoken discussion about how good an artist was, and that would sell the artist. People would pay lots of money to go and see particular artists on stage. So now we're in a different era, aren't we, right? As soon as you go out and do a gig, there's your mate with a camera phone or whatever. People have more a kind of an information base, more diverse kind of information base to find things out from. So it's a bit of a different story, I think. But that whole thing of delivering on the hype is quite interesting.
Do you think that instant gratification side of it is an advantage or a disadvantage to artists these days?
What do you mean by that exactly?
So if we have, I don't know, if we do a gig and there's lots of camera phones there, I suppose we can instantly get more content online, people can see it. The quality these days of camera phones is pretty good, but then do we lose some of that anticipation Well,
you're not necessarily in control of the consistency of your image. Then.
That's what I mean. Yeah,
I guess, but you are to an extent in terms of, you know, the music you're playing, the dress that you've got on that day, but how that's been portrayed or how that's been sliced and diced and edited or whatever someone's done to it, I guess you're losing a bit of control, maybe in terms of how you're packaging that image brand.
And also, I think young people, probably more than anybody, live so much in public anyway now. So I guess the question is there, you know, if you're always living in public and you decide to form a band, almost you have to go through a private period to kind of rehearse and hone what you're doing and then present it to the audience. So if you don't do that and just get straight up on stage and have that exposure immediately, you better be good.
True, that's a good point. Yeah,
and that's another good point actually that you've raised there. You know, if someone, if you've got a particular image that you portray on stage, and someone might bump into you on the street, and you're not in that same image, in the same outfit that you would have on stage or whatever, then there might be almost, I don't know, it could be a disappointment, or it could just be an acknowledgement of, well, that's what they look like, you know, during the day, but there could be potential disappointment for that artist not living and breathing who the character is that they see on stage, maybe.
Oh, absolutely. I was just thinking when you were saying that of the video bloggers, which are, you know, a really new generation of sort of pop and associated with pop people. And, you know, even these video bloggers kind of sit at home and you know, present themselves to the world. But they, you know, even though that seems like a very natural and normal thing to do in a YouTube era, they still have celebrity images. And they suddenly start realising that people have certain expectations from them or certain concerns. They've got an image, and they suddenly kind of realise it once they're out and about, and people expect them to behave in a certain way, and that goes very doubly for musicians, right?
Yeah, definitely.
That actually quite leads nicely onto your next one, point 3 there, being memorable.
Yeah, I just meant using history, making history, using spaces, trying to make memories, rather than just doing things the same as everybody else. Because it's really a kind of obvious point, but you know, you stand out if you do things differently to other people, and so sort of being creative is in part just doing that in different ways, taking the initiative. And the example of that I had was the Beatles' final live performance. Do you know where that was?
It was on the roof at I can't remember the exact building, but it's on the roof of a building, isn't it, when they did Get Back?
That's right, yeah. It was a rooftop concert. And how often do you see a rooftop concert? Not very often.
Until U2 stole it, that was about it, really.
So it worked, you know, people remember it as an important event. But there was plenty of others. I mean, there's all sorts of stories of the Sex Pistols doing gigs in odd, unusual places, and people doing gigs on the backs of trucks. That used to happen years ago.
Yeah.
Or, like in cinemas, or you're just in spaces that people don't normally do that. And I think it then becomes interesting.
Yeah, one of the first episodes that we did was with Paul Smith from Maximo Park, and he said in the early days he used to hold a book up on stage. He didn't give any explanation as to what it was or why it was there, but it gave the audience almost something to think about. Why was the book there? It was a point of reference or a point to remember. Which was far smaller than the example of the Beatles doing a gig on a roof, but it was just a little thing that was quick, easy, didn't cost anything, in the hope that if someone was going to see 2, 3, 4 bands that evening, then there was at least a couple of little things that might make someone remember their band over the others that were playing.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good example, and I think probably people were thinking, what's that book about? Like, why does he like it? What does that give him? And of course, in a sense, that comes off the back of the sort of 60s, 70s era, where it was well known that musicians were taking inspiration from literature in different ways, like Mark Bolan reading like The Lord of the Rings, or David Bowie reading all sorts of things. So there's a certain it sort of suggests there's something to trace about the person, doesn't it? That they've got an kind of interior life, and that they're thinking about things and going somewhere.
Yeah, adding character to someone, isn't it?
I like that. I think that sort of ties into the whole building the story bit of the image.
Yeah.
Every artist is also a person, and they'll have all sorts of interesting things about
quirks and stuff.
So presenting that or sharing that in certain ways to sort of get your fans' audience interested. Which again, I guess flows onto the next point of, well, it might do. Number 4, play your audience as an instrument. So, what do you mean by that, Mark?
Yeah, I thought it was a good point. I was interested about this one.
Well, I think of it in multiple different ways, but I can remember I was in a pub a while ago seeing a couple of different bands who'll be nameless, and the first band came on, and they were really creative, but they were kind of like musos.
Right.
They were kind of like looking at their instruments, kind of concentrating on what they were doing, like focusing in on it. And then the second band came on, and they were kind of like idiots, basically. but they were having fun and having a party, and they kind of got the audience involved, and they kind of raised the spirit in the room. And so I think that whole thing, there's that famous sort of move in the 60s where all of a sudden, like, the Beatles are playing the studio as a musical instrument. Well, why don't you think about playing the audience as a musical instrument? And that can happen in all sorts of different ways, from sort of saying things that then sort of solicit heckling or solicit some kind of response. So punk bands, they did it in all sorts of different ways, or also including your audience as part of your representation, which I think is crucial. In other words, think about punk, right? When punk first started, think about the Grundy interview. Everybody looking at the Grundy interview is seeing not just the band, but a couple of fans standing up at the back behind them. Like, this is more than just a band; it's a movement, or it's a. I theorise that in terms of what people call totemism, and totemism is a really simple idea, which is if a lot of people pay attention to one person, that person seems to be socially valuable, and so it becomes kind of exciting to get closer to them. And so that's what I meant by playing the audience as an instrument.
Yeah,
that's interesting. When you were talking there, I was instantly just thinking about Morrissey, and the Smiths would often have fans on the stage and being part of the live performance, and it was a movement of
it's like
sorts.
A game as well, isn't it?
It was a dedicated following.
Yeah,
certainly.
yeah. But every time we've seen Morrissey, it's like a game. People trying to get up and doing all sorts of weird and wonderful
to
things.
Have that moment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, he's kind of a bit awkward in his own stardom, isn't he? But at the same time, Morrissey's a good example because My brother was telling me he was at a Morrissey gig where there was a distance between the audience and the stage, and Morrissey actually beckoned everybody to kind of run up to the front, and so the security people were like, no, but Morrissey encouraged that kind of crashing of the barrier. So, I mean, and then, you know, all the pictures of him won't be him by himself. It will be him with that audience and the interaction and the sort of spirit they have that's communal. And, you know, I always think about, like, worldwide wrestling, right? When you watch worldwide wrestling, imagine it without the audience.
Yeah.
What have you got left? You've got nothing.
Yeah.
And I think popular music at its best, you know, should include the audience, and it does include the audience in different ways. You know, even down to things like Taylor Swift wrapping gifts for her fans. You know, that might be, you know, you could see that from a cynical viewpoint, right? But at the same time, you know, that kind of inclusion of the fans in the representation, I think, is crucial to developing yourself as a sort of professional artist. And I think that the bands that don't do that, because there are also some that don't do that so much, I just think they're less interesting.
Yeah. I think actually as a good example as well as in, I think it was 99, it might be 98, Robbie Williams had gone solo, and he was just Robbie Williams. But he managed to be on Glastonbury, and he did Angels, and the crowd sang along, and that was, to be honest, I'm neither here nor there with Robbie Williams, but he definitely knows how to use the audience as a instrument or prop or what have you. But that was a turning point for his career, in my opinion. And I would, yeah.
Well, equally on a similar note, you know, the Queen Live Aid performance with Freddie. I mean, there's a way to use the audience.
Yeah, true.
Absolutely, and that takes some doing because of the size of that audience. But of course, that, you know, that audience already knew Queen's music, and I mean, I would have to agree with you that, you know, like him or not, Robbie Williams does know how to use the audience, and he does kind of generate some of that interaction. And I mean, I also think maybe there's sort of aspects within this of genre or archetype. In other words, tapping into things that the audience already knows to develop that. But it's interesting looking at it for me, because when I was looking at Elvis, like right from the off, the audience is kind of rolled into his representation, you know, whether it's the people screaming at the Overton Park Shell when he starts shaking his leg, or the fans from the fan club being put in the front row of the audience when he appears on TV to generate a better response. There's that sort of that's what marketing really is. It's that sort of constant rolling of the audience back into the representation so that it looks like you're going on to bigger and bigger things.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. This actually fits nicely to the next part, which is use your music.
Yeah, my question for that is then, you know, it's all right to talk about that with Queen or somebody, but how do you start small with it? You know?
Yeah, I just wrote that down actually about. I've mentioned this before in another interview. I don't know whether I'm just obsessed with it, but the Foo Fighters documentary Sonic Highways, they did a whole episode about the Washington DC punk scene.
Right.
And these are bands who, at the time, were very small, had a very ruthless fan base, but they engaged the audience very well. It was a case of come on stage. It was stage diving, basically. Late 70s, early 80s. Stage diving. Come on stage, jump straight off. Come on stage, jump straight off. And the band played around the audience. And it was almost... That kind of bled into the 90s as well, because I remember going to see the band Bush, and they always invited the crowd on the stage at the end.
Yeah, it happens in all sorts of ways, and it's an age-old thing. I mean, I was talking about Elvis there. When he was at the New Frontier Hotel, he wasn't going down too well with the audience, so what his record company did is that they presented him with a gold record that they had already presented him with once before.
Right.
And so, you know, this sort of process of kind of sort of signifying the audience in different ways happens all over, right? It happens with YouTube hits now. And another piece of research I did was asking concert promoters why they were advertising gigs that had already sold out.
All right.
Because you would think that would be completely illogical, right? They sold all the seats to the gigs. Why advertise it? And for them, that's a part of the process of building up the artist. It's kind of consumer training. But they are saying, get quicker at buying those tickets because they sold out so quick this time.
Yeah, no, that makes absolute sense.
Yeah, it's good marketing, yeah.
Maybe some of that's at a larger level, but yeah, absolutely, with the punk thing. I mean, imagine punk without the audience. There is nothing.
Yeah.
I mean, and I mean that in a good way. That in
a
sense, it's a folk form of music. That everybody's included.
Rather than going through that again, James, and going through all the key 10 points, just got some key bits I would like to pick up on.
You've gone from key points to key bits.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent.
What was the first thing that you thought? Actually, that's a really good point. Or bit.
I like this. There was a lot about various artists who've stolen from the past. So I liked the bit which was talking around. Right, there's a generational side of things.
Yes.
Right. If you're going to steal from the past, don't steal from just a couple of years ago, because that's probably recently run its course and gone out of fashion.
Yes.
And the people who lived through it have already consumed.
It's probably you.
It's the same people, and it's like, well, he gave a good example of why rock and roll was so successful when it pulled on gospel and R&B and all these other genres, and just sort of brought a lot of things together.
Mm-hmm.
So loads of bands and artists have been successful about pinching bits and pieces from things from the past. So there's definitely something in that.
Definitely.
So I think the key bit I took from it is if you're going to do that, and there's nothing wrong with doing that, because lots of very talented people have been very good at doing that.
A living off that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it can be one of the best, most creative ways if you pull from various different things to create a new whatever. It's given some thought to what it is that you're taking stuff from. If you're just taking stuff or copying or
just
borrowing
stealing a riff.
things from something that's very recent, then from that conversation, which makes perfect sense to me, that's maybe not the best way of going about doing it. So
yeah, that is a good point. If you think about drawing from the past, is one of the key things he said. It's not a bad thing. It's influences. It's showing how you've interpreted music when you've been growing up, the sort of things that influence your way of playing on the guitar, maybe, or the way you sing, or the lyrics you choose. If you were to choose from about 2 years ago, let's just say you thought, I really like the Arctic Monkeys. You start writing songs like the Arctic Monkeys. Their second album, third album, or whatever album they may be on at the time that you start writing your first or second album, they've probably gone on to their next phase. So you're going to sound,
they'll be evolving, won't they?
They'll be evolving. You're going to be left behind. But also, if your album's released the same days as the Monkeys is, it's pretty much 9 out of 10 people are going to buy the new Arctic Monkeys because you just sound like a gimmicky version of them. I'm just picking them as a recent example.
I think it's a good point from our experiences, right? It's sort of in the time we were in the band, and we may have fallen foul of little bits of this, but when we first started, you still had some almost Oasis-y type copy bands that morphed into sort of libertine type copy bands that, just as we were finishing and the Arctic Monkeys came out, there was a lot of those type of bands, and again there was a lot of obvious sort of people doing, and like I said, not necessarily, you could understand where they've come from. This is the current type of music. We want to create this type of music.
You've got to get very lucky. And you've got no story behind it. The story that we've spoken about a couple of times.
Yeah, and if there is a wave of a certain type of music, sometimes there'll be other bands that sort of get some success on the coattails of the lead band, if you like. Yep. But yeah, I think that the true creators, innovators, will have taken things from potentially much further in the past, or taken a wider group, set of influences.
Yeah, and normally when you hear a band come out and similar bands come after them, it's just that the market look quickly for it and they just snap up bands that are similar. If you're then trying to get into that trend, it might be quite tricky. I think you have to stay true to your art, fans, people who come to see you week in, week out, or month in, month out, depending on how you gig. And it's just staying true to yourself about what your influences are, and that whole thing of generations going back and forth. So I listen to stuff that my mum listened to.
Yeah.
So Band 3, the Beatles, but I didn't listen to much stuff that was her favourites in the 70s and stuff, because she didn't listen to them as much because she had her bands from the 60s when she was growing up, and that kind of goes into circles of when we were growing up and stuff, listening to Beatles or even stuff like ABC from the 80s. That was big albums at the time. You kind of drift into like what influences you.
Well, I do think there's a lot in that generational thing. I mean, Beatles sold so many, and the same as when my mum had Beatles records, in the house, and you get interested in what that?
They are. It's interesting, yeah, and you can kind of hear it in some of the bands that are our age, got those influences in their music.
Yeah. So just when we've been mentioning the Arctic Monkeys, I just remember another bit that we got onto, and it sort of only relates to the Arctic Monkeys in the sense of their first single. Or the video, maybe, if I remember rightly, said, don't believe the hype, or he said something along that at the start of it. And we talked a little bit about there's a danger of not being able to deliver on the hype.
Yes.
Versus if there's no hype at all, then that's equally a bad thing. So in terms of what a fan is expecting.
Yeah, and to be honest, you could have me and you in a crowd, and this has happened before where we've been in crowds with people that we know were there and had two completely different experiences at the same gig. We had the hyped up version of wanting to see this band, and they weren't as good as we were anticipating.
Versus a V Festival when we saw Hot Chip.
Yes.
I hadn't really listened to any of their stuff at the time, and knew very little about them. So I remember he's only on their second album. I can't remember what.
I think there were a couple in,
and possibly the best performance I saw at the festivals. I had no expectations going into that and came away a fan.
Yeah, and I think we started doing that when the first V Festival we went to, and we were just like, I want to see the Chili's that were on, and Foos were playing and Coldplay were playing. But we went to see the Coral, who we'd seen a million times before, and they were probably the best band of the weekend. But ever since then, we always try to compare, like, who's going to be the band that we're just going to come out of nowhere. So I think there's an element of, like, I know we're kind of like jumping around a bit and quite contradictory what we're saying, but there's an element of surprise and an element of, like, Coldplay. I was like, Coldplay will be brilliant, and they were.
It's back to a lot of what's coming out on a lot of the episodes. There's a balance to strike.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and keeping the fans in mind is something.
Yeah, and one of a great thing that Mark mentioned, right, was making memories. So whether there's that performance, at a festival, or whether he's specifically gone to someone's gig, it's what is that memory? What's that magical moment or bit? So whether it's in a live performance, or whether it's in a song, or whether it's in something you're doing on social media, or why is someone going to remember that thing? Why is that going to be special? If there's a fan, right, someone who really genuinely loves you or your music or whatever, then I guess you do want like some pretty good memories.
Yeah. Well, that's the whole point, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. Otherwise, I guess you're forgettable.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's probably a lot of bands we have forgot about that we've seen over the years.
Well, yeah.
Likewise.
At no point did we sit down as a band and think, right, how we're going to create a special memory for our fans.
Sometimes it does come organic, because I was thinking about that, and I never knew this was going to happen, but when we started playing, people started going shoes off. And then all of a sudden it became a thing, and people who I'd spoke to, not at a gig, about the band were like, yeah, all your mates take their shoes off, don't they?
That is true, and there was a period, it's a good point, actually.
It happened
a lot of
throughout.
A lot of promoters and other people would sort of like, you're the ones where everyone takes their shoes off at the end type thing, and that was a memory. No, you're right. We didn't specifically go about,
and I think that's how it worked. It was organic. We weren't expecting it. People remembered it, and what they do then, put the two and two together, is
that was a memory for people at the gig as well who didn't know us before.
Yeah, and then they remember a lot of shoes flying, therefore there was a lot of people there.
I remember a lot of shoes flying. It was quite. It was probably the worst part of the gig for me.
Yeah, probably was, and Rob's kit. But then they remember that's a lot of shoes, which is a lot of feet, which is a lot of people, which is a lot of beer sucked. So they think, let's get them on again. When we did it, when we played Leeds in Liverpool, they were a bit like, who are these daft Geordies throwing shoes about? Because it's not something that, like, I don't know why.
It was different, like we were talking about whether it's crowd surfing or whether it's whatever the thing might be, or people going onto stage to share time with people. It is something different. That's the key thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, whatever that memory's going to be, people are going to remember it if it's not the norm.
Yeah, and that was one of the key points. I think it's on there, like, playing your audience as an instrument. It's like, people want to be part of it, and it always reminded me, I think I mentioned it in there, about Top of the Pops. Like, the crowd are almost on the band. Like, Jools Holland's quite similar.
Yeah.
There's a bit more space between Jools Holland, but that's because of the way it's set up. But, like, the fans being part of it. I remember we saw James at the Isle of Wight Festival, and they just got loads of people that come on during a certain song. I can't remember which one it was, and it was like, it's like a shared experience, which is what music is, and gig going, but having that connection with the artist. And that could be something like when we spoke to Paul about his book, and then remembering that little bit.
Just thinking, the funniest experience I've heard, I wasn't there, but something you told me about, of people from the audience getting on stage was Enrique Iglesias.
Oh man, yeah. So like, my wife loves Enrique. I've seen him twice now, and I reckon at both of those gigs I could have been harpooned and she would never have noticed. It's just, and to be honest, he puts on a brilliant show, and I remember these shows.
I think you now suggest going to these gigs rather than...
Well, let's put it this way, the last one was 6 rows from the front. But, yeah, but like, I remember those gigs because he always gets someone on for Hero, and then this woman got very overexcited and threw a wedding ring into the crowd and shouted all the way through Hero, which I must admit is not my favourite Enrique Iglesias song, so it didn't bother us too much. But a lot of people went to see him for that song, and that's a memory which was good and bad probably for them, because she ruined it, but everyone went, she threw a wedding ring into the crowd there. Yeah. And he couldn't comprehend it.
I'm not married now.
Yeah, not anymore. Out it went.
Wow.
But yeah, that whole thing brought the crowd in, because literally onto the stage. Something that she'll never forget. We'll probably never forget in the crowd, and the person that got a ring flung at their face will never forget it because of the wedding ring hitting in the face.
Well, another good example, and obviously there's more ways of creating a memory than getting people on stage, but it is a classic. After the Paul Smith interview, when we saw them and C6 Steve supporting, if you remember the girl who got on stage.
Oh, a couple of nights later.
Was that a couple of nights later?
That
was Brian Wilson, wasn't it? Yeah. That was, same venue, wasn't it?
Yeah.
This girl, it had made her...
It blew her mind.
Made a month, by the look of it. You know, she was massively bowled over by the fact that C6 Steve had got her on stage and was singing a particular song to her. That was like... And that one moment, I mean, that person clearly was not going to forget that.
No. There's a lot of people in the crowd as well. There's lots of ahs. And like a lot of people won't forget that as well. Like, I think you've got to come on stage and play a really nice song.
Well, I guess I've remembered it.
Yeah.
And my memory's shocking, so...
Yeah, no offence, but you're not the biggest C6 Steve fan in the world. But now you remember C6 Steve, the name, because of that moment.
Well, he was good. Well, another memorable part of his set was, you know, all the random instruments he's got that he's made himself out of
hubcaps and stuff,
whatever he's made them out of, and that's different and therefore memorable. You know, he's played the washboard or whatever
it might be. Yeah, that's a good example. Yeah,
thanks.
Yeah, okay. And a couple of things I just want to quickly point out. We mentioned about constant style, like image, music, story, brand, and keeping that constant thing going on, but like tweaking it every now and again. When we use the example Coldplay, every album seems to be its own entity. So like Viva La Vida had all like the military outfits and stuff, and the videos were all that type of military stuff. And then you got the album that had Every Teardrop on it. It's all colourful and so very good, like paint going on in it. It seems very colourful paint. The latest album's all colourful as well, but it's just slightly adapting it each time. I think it helps the story along, and it helps the image along, and everything's kind of branded, which is really, I think that's a good example for like a band of their stature.
Yeah, well, I think it's definitely in terms of keeping fans engaged and interested. You know, if you're a band, you've got a certain sound. If you help parcel that next album or chunk of music up slightly differently, then it's less likely to come across as just a rehash of what you've done before or a repetitive whatever.
Yeah, exactly. And I think actually this kind of leads on to the next part, because Coldplay probably sell out every single gig they do. But we didn't mention about Why do people put sold out on the tour posters? Consumer training.
Yeah,
that is,
which is, I guess, an obvious one. But what I was thinking about that though is that often, certainly for artists who are much smaller, in terms of, there's often, we've done this before. You might have 100 people coming, but it just so happens that this gig is in a room that could fit 400 people. And it feels a bit empty, as opposed to the next gig where you might have 60 people, but it's in a room that fits 65 people, and it just feels absolutely awesome.
Mm-hmm.
So it's different to the selling out bit per se, but maybe there is something in making sure you get smaller venues, you book them out, sell them out, because you can do that sort of consumer training almost, where selling out shows, because that's something that's generally a good thing.
That's a good point, yeah. But
also there's another benefit to, certainly I thought it was far better to be playing a tiny packed out place than a big place.
It creates a memory, creates a moment, I went to see this band yesterday who were unsigned, but the place was packed. I mean, it might be a mirage because it might be 50 people, but it doesn't matter. It's still the words sold out, packed, and couldn't get in.
Yeah. Makes complete difference to having twice as many people in a huge space that isn't filled. So I think there's something in that.
Definitely.
So
that's part one.
That is part one.
Next week, part two. We've got obviously.
I feel like I want to claim that as two.
No, that was just Lost Logic. Is it? That Lost Logic.
You've lost something.
That's my story, the Ben Steele story, Lost Logic. No, well, my point is, we're going to look into the remainder of.
We're going to move on from part one to part two.
Yeah, look at the remainder of Mark's list.
There's some more great stuff coming up next week.
There was a couple of things about the entertainment side of it, which is so obvious, but you just don't think of until you get up and go, oh yeah, this is what I do. So join us at part two, which comes after part one.
Brilliant. See you next week. So next week we continue with Mark, where we get on to being a star, being a fan, entertaining people, ideas and values, and collaboration.
We've reached the end of this week's episode of Anyone Can Play Guitar podcast.
Big thank you for tuning in, and remember to stop by iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts from and subscribe so that you never miss an episode.
While you're there, it would be amazing if you could leave a rating and a review.
All the show notes can be found at www.acpgmusic.com, and if you want to get in touch,
email us your questions, any feedback and any suggestions to info@acpgmusic.com.
That's it for now. Keep supporting upcoming artists,
and we'll catch you next time.